What up, meatheads? It's Travis, American Butcher. And this is the Meat Block Podcast, the weekly podcast by butchers for everyone. And in this week's episode, I was invited to do the Focus on Farming by Linda Newson again in Snohomish County. It is an agricultural event to educate farmers on better growing practices, better yield, employment, and things like that. And it was great. I had a good time. Unfortunately, I could really only be there for my segment, so I guess I had fun doing what I do, even though you're going to listen to it and it sounds a little awkward because I have a horrible fear of speaking publicly sometimes. And you can't tell, but there was like a couple thousand people watching me. That's just the recorder I was using just didn't pick up the laughs and the thunderous applause that you're used to when I give talks in front of people. But before I get to the episode, if you love this show, what you do, because you're listening, and thank you, and you like my Instagram or my content, The American Butcher, please check out my Patreon, link in bio. And I can't guarantee that the Meat Block is going to be every week anymore, just because life is getting busy with practicing and work and other ventures. But what I can guarantee you is if you join my Patreon page, you will get one bonus episode of American Butcher Podcast, which is a podcast with me. You could ask me anything, literally, I'll tell you, on that podcast. And you'll also get a how-to video once a month. There's different tiers and different programs to help support your brand and your business using the resources that I have collected over the years. So please check it out. The reason I do this podcast, The Meat Block, and love being on the team and having an Instagram presence is because when I got into this industry, I hated gatekeepers. I hated the covenant knowledge. And that's why I love everything that I'm able to bring, or what I appreciate the skill set that I do have, even though by no means do I think I'm great or anything like that. I've been in this industry for a while, so I just have tips and tricks that other people were thankful enough to pass on to me. And that's what I want to pass on to you, the listener. So please check out this Patreon. Please support the American team. And this is a recording from Focus on Farming, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. All right, just want to interrupt my own intro here. This is releasing November 13th, 2019. It is my birthday, so what you could get me is clicking on that link and joining the Patreon. Here's the show.
Good cutting enhances the quality of good meat. Poor cutting results in an inferior piece of meat, regardless of quality.
Dad, I'd like to introduce Travis Stockstill, right? Mm-hmm. Almost slipped up there.
Yeah, people want to add a DRW.
Well, almost. I've met him a few times. He's avid in the cut industry. He's a member of the Butchers of America, which he'll elaborate on a little bit. He also runs a really good podcast called the Meat Block. I bounce in on that typically, and without any more, I'll just hand it over.
All right. So my name's Travis. I'm working on my projecting. Last year I was told I didn't project well. I'm on the United States Butcher team, one of 6 American butchers representing our country in the 2020 World Butchers Challenge to compete for Best Butcher in the world, I guess, against 16 other nations. I got my start in working in slaughterhouses, and with overturn in that industry, I was just able to stick up with it. Check. With overturning the industry, I just stuck with it and kept working up and finding myself in different positions and things like that. I started a podcast a couple years ago. We're on 142 episodes. Everything from interviewing growers to chefs to just talking to butchers and talking about is this a good industry, our thoughts, and it's very candid. And sometimes we're dealing with butchers who talk like butchers. So if you listen, it's sometimes adult themed. And then, but I've worked in multiple cut and wraps. Right now I'm a production manager for a USDA smokehouse that provides stuff in Seattle and local grocery chains and things like that. I'm a smokehouse operator as well as a whole carcass butcher, and I've designed 2 cut and wraps. And then I've got these out, and then because I'm just going to talk about different cuts that you could get, because and everyone could feel free to grab one of these. It just breaks down the primals, because a lot of people don't understand what comes on a carcass or what they could use and things that are seasonal. And yeah, so we'll start with beef. And the reason is this, because when I work in cut and wraps and dealing with farmers, I'll hear a lot of times that people want the best example is they want, like, filling out their cut sheets, they'll want a T-bone or a porterhouse, but they'll also want, a whole tenderloin. And you can't get that because it's the same muscle. And if you take a beef and you split it in half at the vertebral column, and then at that point you're going to have the muscle that runs down the entire spine, and that goes from New York all the way to the ribeye. And it's this whole area right here. And on the inside, on the other wing bone, as we call it, there is the tenderloin that rests. So to get both cuts, you need to cross-cut that, and that would be your porterhouse, which is your thicker end. And if you cut a porterhouse that thick, it's called a, Florentine. And then the only way you could truly get a tenderloin roast out of that is when you break it from the sirloin, which is up in here, you're going to end up with the head of the tenderloin, which is called the Chateaubriand. So if you say you want porterhouses and a whole tenderloin, your cut and wrapper is going to say no. But a good cut and wrap facility should be able to say, well, you could still get the Chateaubriand. You could still get this. So it's just about knowing the carcass to know your yield and things like that. But then with beef specific, we have to worry about specified risk materials. And if you are growing a animal from typically grass, the specified risk materials is SRM. It's what causes mad cow disease. And gestation time is 30 months. So it's not going to be present in an animal that's under 30 months or over. So in our industry, we have OTMs, which is over 30 months or under 30 months. And carcasses are marked. And if you get one that's OTM, it's going to have on its spine, it's going to be blue all the way down. And that's to indicate during the slaughter process that during the cut and wrap process that whole vertical, it's called the vertical column, needs to be removed. And that's the best example of what is going to affect your cuts. SRM, or specified risk materials, are also found in the eyes and in the skull and in the brain. That's why it's very hard to get beef skulls. They technically should be condemned after 30 months of age. The eyes are always considered SRM, and then the tonsils and the tongue. That's why if you get short tongues, sometimes it's someone who doesn't know where to cut it properly. It's because they want to ensure that they're not giving you SRM, or specified risk material. There hasn't been a case of mad cow disease occurring in America in a very long time. It's because animals eat proteins of themselves. Essentially, it's a prion that is passed down, but it also is a prion that could live on the surface of the sun. So there's really nothing to do to get rid of it. But yeah, so that being said, over 30 months, you're not going to be able to get your T-bones at all. You're going to get a boneless New York, because we got to get those wings tips out. And then you could get a bone-in ribeye, but all the knob bones need to be removed where it connects to the spine. And then you'll get a whole tenderloin and things like that. Also, if you're raising, what Todd mentioned, is if you're raising a grass-fed animal, you're typically not going to want those cuts anyway, because the marbling isn't going to be there before the 30-month period. I have seen it before where I've seen grass-fed, grass-finished beef with beautiful marbling before the 30 months of age, but it's not common in the industry. When you don't have muscle, or when you don't have fat sitting in the muscle setting up the steak, it's genuinely leaner and floppier, and it has a tendency to fall apart more as well. Moving on to any questions on that, by the way? Just moving down, that only pertains to beef and veal. Their SRM is in the spinal column. It's the actual spinal cord itself. It's this little membrane that needs to be removed. Pork, there's nothing like that. In lamb, there's nothing like that. Now, in game, I think it's called scabies, but I don't process that much game. But depending where you are in America, your game needs to be completely deboned, and a lot of cut and wraps who do game processing may not necessarily follow those because of no oversight. I'm not suggesting there should be. And then custom exempt places, where if you were to see it all the time, that custom guys don't follow the OTM to the T, because this stuff can't go into rendering. It needs to be put into landfill, because if it goes into rendering, specified risk material, since it could live on the surface of the sun, most rendering plants turn it into their own added value product, such as basic protein pellets to add to fish food or to dog food or cosmetics or even soil enrichment programs. So it needs to go straight into landfill. And yeah, this doesn't exist on pigs. Moving up on, I think the chuck is another great example of a primal on beef that people don't realize that you can't get one thing or the other. So there's not much in this market, but there's a 7-bone chuck, which is a cross-cut section of the chuck that had the blade bone or scapula still in it. And on one side of the scapula is the chuck roast, and on the other side is the flat iron. So if someone says they want a 7-bone chuck and they also want flat irons, then you can't have both. And some people will say, well, if you fill out a cut sheet where you want 1/2 beef cut this way or 1/2 beef cut the other way, that is one solution around it. And in the state of Washington, even when you're doing custom, I'll just say that there. But so you could divide up the beef that way, but it's really on the specs that you're cutting around. There's great facilities here in Washington that will work with you on that. I work at facilities that will give you a standard cut sheet, and it is so much per pound, and any add-ons is going to be an additional 50 cents per pound. And they're going to really gear you not to do that because it changes their bottom line. And that's when many mistakes happen in cut facilities, is when they're removed from the routine, especially with working with individual beef, because you have people who are doing things in mechanical motion, and you're not getting paid by the hour, you're getting paid by the pound. So it's about how much you could get pushed out at the time. Moving with pork, the loin, that muscle going all the way down into your rib section. If you can't get baby backs if you want bone-in chops, because the ribs on that loin is what makes the bone for the bone-in chops. And then genuinely baby backs are used from less desirable pigs where you can leave more meat on the baby back. So, and then you would end up either curing the loin section to make what is either called rasher bacon or Canadian bacon. That just varies on how much of the tail is left on it. And the tail on that is the belly, which you would make regular bacon out of. True rasher or English style bacon is that whole muscle with the belly continuing all the way down. That's what you'd also make your porchetta out of. So when working as growers, I'm sure most of you guys are, and finding an outlet, are you working daily with or weekly with a certain buyer, like a chef? So most of my job is talking to chefs in Seattle and then saying, I want X amount of chuck roast. Well, I may be out of it because I have so many carcasses I'm pushing through and there could be a standing order, but understanding their needs, well, what are you going to make out of it? Are you going to make a oven roast? Is it going to be a braising cut? And then offering a solution. Well, if you're going to braise it, a lot of people don't realize that beef shank braises very well. You could shred it and turn it into like pulled beef, and it's delicious. So, there's that old meme that I've seen where it's like, I'm a butcher, I solved so many problems before 10 a.m. I think it can be said in any industry, anyone can say that. But yeah, so most of my job is just problem solving. Education and problem solving for the buyer, because I'm working with and in cut and wraps, I'm working for my company, working for a farmer who may not know the conversation or how to have that conversation because they're selling it to a chef. Then the chef's also trying to communicate with you. So it's just to have the best understanding and keep this game of telephone, because like you'll get cut sheets, and if there's a note section in the cut sheets, they get very creative, and like cut and wrap is going to do the best they can to interpret it, because the last thing they want to do is step aside and call you when they're in the middle of pushing everything out. That being said, if you're selling a whole carcass to a individual, and you may want them to create the cut sheet, and then your transaction is done once the animal is slaughtered, and it's their responsibility to pick it up and do everything they want from there. But if you're trying to piece out an animal, it's very hard because you're going to need cold storage to store the things that you're not able to get rid of on a weekly basis. Biggest thing I've run into with small farmers, I used to work for a mobile slaughter unit that is no longer around in northern Washington that had a small USDA cut and wrap facility on it that we would sell products to Seattle. We could get rid of the ribeyes, we could get rid of the New Yorks, we could get rid of the tenderloins, but we had a whole freezer full of short ribs. We had a whole freezer full of trim. And it's just really having someone who not only knows the animal, but has the time to find outlets for it, because you have a year shelf life by the USDA, and sometimes they'll only give you 6 months, but it depends how you write your food safety program, to get rid of this product. And if your product is packaged and you're storing it on your facility and it has a USDA bug on it, you are still allowed to sell it, because the people who receive it just has to show that it has been inspected and has the mark of wholesomeness, regardless if it's stored at a USDA facility or at your personal place. It just shows that it was processed under the guise of inspection. Then moving with custom exempt. Custom exempt is a great way to do farm shares or animal shares. If you are a small farmer in the state of Washington, I believe you could break up a beef into 32 parts. So if you have like a CSA and you have like for X amount of money a month, people sign up and they could get a roast, they could get a pack of ground beef, they could get like 2 steaks, and you could really push it with things that you have extra of. If you have so much ground beef and that you don't know what to do with their short ribs or braising cuts, you could save them till the wintertime, you could save them till your hamburger till the summertime. And then when you get these start your CSA and sell directly to the customer, as long as they give you the deposit when the animal is still alive, then it's good. Or you could even do the CSA if it's all under USDA inspection and just piece it together as orders come in. And if you're having if you want to circumvent the USDA, it's really easy to get it's easier than you think to get approved for a health department kitchen. I had one in my basement when I lived in Bellingham. It was approved by the state. I had, and I was allowed to sell a single ingredient item to a restaurant. A single ingredient item could be lettuce. It could also be a steak. So like I wouldn't sell them sausage or anything, but it'd be ground beef. It could be things like that. And by easy, like I had to have certain sinks and meet certain requirements, but it was not as big of a headache as I thought it was going to be. You could also do those same things in commissary kitchens. If you want to have a CSA, you could rent out space in commissary kitchen if you have a list of clients already. But again, it's I'm sure I don't have to tell you guys this. You gotta find your client base first before you can scale and things like that as well. Moving on to other cuts that you could get, so a pork shoulder, you have your bone in Boston butt, skin on or skin off. It's very difficult to get skin on pigs here in Washington right now, unless you go from like east of the Cascades and get it from Paul. I think he's the only one who's scalding. I do know someone who's selling a scalder up north though. And then, so it's a Boston butt's going to be skin on or skin off. And then if people want a copa roll or something to make charcuterie out of, essentially they're moving the chuck roll out of that. And that would be something that you would make cottage bacon out of, something you would make char siu out of, which is really good. A lot of your cured products are going to come from that. So knowing what your final product, what you want, are you going to raise this animal to be charcuterie, or are you going to raise it to be for barbecue? And then even when you start getting into charcuterie animals, you want to think more about like fattier animals, Mangalisas right now are really popular with people doing charcuterie, and mule foots, anything with like what is considered a lard pig, even kunis, and those are like that big, are considered a lard pig because of their fat content versus like a leaner pig. And those are more heritage breeds, and you get a whole thing about why heritage breeds and all that. Any questions so far?
Why don't you touch base, go back a little bit to what you're iterating in what you mentioned on the WSDA customs side, your CSA, and how important it is for producers to make sure under the custom that they have that deposit and or most of that animal sold live.
Yeah, so
because that's a mistake. It's not a mistake. It's just the lack of knowledge.
Yeah. So like the animal needs to be, if it's not going through a USDA or a retail kitchen, which I failed to mention is that retail kitchen for you to part out needs to come from an inspected facility. So if you get it slaughtered at a mobile unit, or if you buy subprimals at cash and carry, as long as it comes in with the USDA bug, you can portion it out and give it to a restaurant or wholesaler, or sell it straight to the customer at a farmer's market. Talking about what Todd was saying is when you sell a custom exempt beef, and you could break it up into your 32 parts for 32 customers, a lot of time what growers are going to do is maybe they don't want to sell it in 32. That's just the maximum. Maybe they want to sell in quarters or eighths. They'll wait until they get a deposit from 8 people, and then they'll then the animal will be slaughtered. But in theory, the cash needs to be exchanged at that point. If it is a dollar deposit, then they will pay first on the yield. It's kind of like this gray area. It's I would say that you're going to want at least, $50 down, and then they'll pay the difference, and that will be just a wrapping fee, and you can put it in as that. Did that help? or
Well, and the reason being is on the custom side, and you see it all the time, but it's just education is, as a producer, you're not allowed to go pick up that product after it's been cut and wrapped and then sell.
Yeah, so it's going to be marked as cut or as not for sale. So the best example is my good friend Tracy, who used to work in Rochester. He did a lot of custom stuff, and he would get it from a farmer, have X amount of cut sheets or priorities that each person needed to get. It'd be put in a milk crate with that person's name. Those individuals would come up and pick up the product, and they would like Venmo Tracy or give Tracy the money, before the animal was. But the farmer cannot pick up the product and then sell it too, because that it's going to stay very clear on it, not for sale. And if it doesn't, it should. And custom exempt, like I said, the same rules apply as far as SRM and specified risk materials. If you have an animal that's 30 months or older, a good custom exempt processor will tell you not to, that you can't get T-bones and you can't get certain cuts. Things like that. Moving on, I guess to lamb is the other things where it's like versus what you can get, what you can't get. Lamb, if you're selling lamb and you don't have an outlet for your shanks, I would all recommend saving them until spring for satyrs and for Easter and things like that. Yeah. Lamb shanks, if you find the right market, especially in Seattle, you can find an outlet for them. If you have a whole leg of lamb, it's usually cut at the sirloin, and the sirloin most of the time is going to be turned into trim. Some people get cross-cut bone-in sirloin steaks. There's so many muscle groups in there, they don't cook well, so I just wouldn't recommend doing that. Whole leg of lamb, that's your classic Easter, that's your classic thing like that, which means you can't get a butterfly leg of lamb because you can't get the same cut out of one cut. Lamb belly, most places are going to turn into trim, but there is a flank steak in there, there is steak tips in there. You could shear lamb belly and then roll it up tight and then make lamb bacon, which is, again, you're going to have to find a producer who wants to do that. A lot of cut and wrap facilities in the state of Washington do not do cooked added value product. They will do raw added value products such as sausages. And then you're going to have to find the best you're most likely is going to be, at that point, custom exempt added value. We're going to take it to an individual who has a smokehouse. And then that is where you sell it to the customer at that point, and then they deal with it taken to the smokehouse because you can't take it and sell it. Or if you're a grower and you get a bunch of them, let's say 40 of them, you can take them to me at my work, and we'll work it out when we're slow. Because we run, you could run 1,500 pounds of smoked product a day. And that there's interesting things if you're dealing with the chef on lamb. You can get more than just a bone-in or a loin chop or a lamb chop. You can bone out that thing and make a whole beautiful roast with the tenderloin and the both back muscles in it, and let's call it a wasnet roll, and they're about that big. They are beautiful and beautiful presentation. And if you get a chef or a buyer who wants that, I would encourage them to have a picture of the finished product goes way better than a horrible conversation over the phone where everyone ends up unhappy. Just say, hey, can you do this? And then a good skilled butcher should be able to look at that and understand it as well. And then with bones, a lot of times you see cut and wrap facilities, and regardless of the bones they have, or regardless of the animal, there's big bone piles, there's big yield piles, and that's where I hear the number one thing with farmers when I used to be more on that side of the industry is, I gave you an animal that weighed this much and you gave me this product back that weighed this much. There's always the cut and wraps aren't stealing people's meat. They're not like that. Granted, there's people and there's mistakes made and there's crappy people out there, and maybe there's an outlier and some jerk who deserves to get fired. But there's nothing nefarious, and the yield is often lost in people not realizing if they don't mark their bones down, they're not going to get their bones that they make. And when they're cutting an animal, they're not going to weigh your bones. They're going to cut them, put them in a barrel, and then they're going to give you the finished product of it, and that's going to be your yield. So to counteract that, I always recommend, regardless, get your bones back. And if you can't find an outlet for them, just throw them away later. But have them cut it down, and then I would pursue side ramen places, faux places, places that are going to make stocks, places that are going to make demis. You know, if you know how to sell it, you know how to word it to a chef. I always say that, like, I could talk to a chef, they could tell me something they want, I don't have it, but at the end we're both happy because I'm able to unload or, you know, talk like, well, what I can offer you is this, and, you know, it'll tell me about what kind of stocks they're using in house, and yeah, this byproduct that is just, you know, sitting around that you are going to lose money on because, and the cut and wrap's going to lose money on because they got to pay a rendering company to come and get it, and you could sell it for, you know, essentially $1 a pound or whatever you want. That's better than not selling it at all. So I always recommend getting your bones and calling those unique places. You know, like I said, pork bones, great for ramen places. Beef bones, great for ramen places. Lamb bones, you're going to have to find more of a boutique place, and then someplace that makes terrains or aspects, and then get it in that nature as well. And understand the added value product that you could get, more than just a raw steak or a raw hamburger or a raw brine, and communicating with the buyers about the upsell potential and the value they could have at their end as far as making whipped lardo or rillettes with the extra fat that you get. Because if I've had farmers say, I want all the fat, and then just leave all the fat on the chop, and they could be raising a Mangel Lisa, and there will be a bigger fat cap than there is actual meat on it. And no one's going to want to buy that regardless. But they still want it because they're trying to increase their yield. So what that person could do is find an outlet. Like, that being said, it's also, I deal with like 50 pig heads a week that I can't sell. So you have to find a market for it and find your margin as well, or find if it fits in with your margin. And it may not even be worth it to sit on that much product, but because the biggest thing in this industry is cold storage. Eventually you can find a buyer, but you got to store it until you do. And then things with cold storage isn't cheap, especially if you're doing it off-site. And a lot of places will charge you a rental fee if you do it at their facility after a certain amount of time anyway. Any questions on that?
How do you recommend those bones get cut for?
I would say the most manageable way possible. If you have beef bones, and you're sitting on beef bones, they're going to use it for marrow. And if your cut and wrap is comfortable when canoe cutting them, I'd have all beef bones knocked down at the knuckles, have the knuckles split for stocks, and then have them canoe the beef bones. And then you can't really get freezer burn on bones, so I just have them pack it in a lined box because if you vacuum seal them, they're going to pop anyway because there's sharp edges all over it. And then with lamb bones and pork bones, if you have a buyer for pork collar, which is the neck, you can tell them to leave a little bit of meat on. People are going to want that. And I would say cut down all other bones besides beef marrow bones into pieces like that big. It's easy. You just grab a handful of them and saws work with your hips. And then they just package them in, I'd say, like 10-pound boxes, because anyone who's making a stock less than that, you could sell them those smaller split knuckle bones or things like that. And with working with cut and wrap facilities, if you are, you can negotiate, I have found that you can negotiate price per pound versus HRI and retail. So HRI is hotel, restaurants, and institutions. So a school district may say, I want X amount of sausage. It could just be, hey, just put it in a line box, and that's what I want. And you give them a price break, knowing that they are getting all this off my hands, and my packaging is minimal. And versus if they said, I want 1,000 pounds of sausage in 1 pound packs. You know, how much more labor is going into that. So a big thing when I'm working with a buyer or working with a retailer is understanding how they plan to present the finished product. That's huge on labor. And then if you know that, then you could increase your margin by trying to work with the margin of the cut and wrap, saying, versus using X amount of bags and X amount of labor, this is what they want. We work on the price per pound. And they could also say no. So, but it's just a conversation worth having. And then a restaurant, hotel, or institution may want to do the same thing on your end as a farmer. Like, I'm guaranteed that it's going to be a standing order to take this off your hands. And what do we do on your end? That being said, I have had very ambitious chefs and outlets that say, I want once a month, I'm going to take this month. But as a grower, you have to ensure that animal, that you have enough to supply it. And I will make people sign contracts that there will be a penalty for, like, and you don't want to be a jerk about it, but if you're putting in money and you have to increase your herd and you have to increase what you're taking to market, and you can't, and all of a sudden they back out because their menu isn't selling or seasonal and things, that just has to be an expectation on everyone's side to ensure that your business is viable and that they're not painted into a corner. It's like when you sign up for cable, there's a penalty if you break your contract early. It's not like you don't want it to hurt their business, but you also don't want to all of a sudden have to do 3 times more work as you were before. So, yeah, that's important in this industry. On that. Any questions?
I had a question for you, Travis. Can you Can you touch a little bit on the importance of seasonal cutting?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so you've got grilling season.
Yeah. Yeah. So grilling season.
Animal carcasses.
Yeah. So if you're doing seasonal cutting, there is hamburger and steaks and grilling season and things like that. People are going to want more ribeyes. People are going to want baby backs. People are going to want, lamb chops, and that's usually starting around spring and goes until this time of year. And you have drying, so you're not going to have braising cuts. So in the summertime, when braising or cooking liquid is really what it is, you're going to turn your shanks into what people call ossobuco, which semantically translates to leg of veal, but it's not always. And you're going to bone but during the summertime, you're going to take that shank or that ossobuco bone it out, and then mix it into your grind. You don't want to have too much shank in your grind because it is a tougher, richer flavor, because there's a lot more collagen in there. That being said, what you can turn with your shank, if you work with a co-packer, is shank meat makes amazing hot dogs, because all that connective tissue will break down and get really good binding in your hot dogs. So anything that you have emulsification-wise, I'd recommend using shank as well. And then your chuck, and you rarely see it in this part of the country. 7-bone chucks or full chuck steaks. But so what you're going to do with that in the summertime is you turn it into a hamburger, turn it into, and I always recommend a thinner hamburger, like a smash burger, things like that. And then during the summertime, and that will allow you to get your flat irons and market that as well. And then there's a bunch of other little muscles inside the chuck that are hidden. You have the Vegas strip steak, which is underneath the flat iron, which is sometimes called the bottom blade steak. And it's a beautiful, it looks just like a flat iron, but leaner and a lot tenderer. And then in your clawed section of your chuck, you're going to end up with your terrace major, or your petite tender, or your chuck tender. Your mock tender in your chuck is garbage. I just grind that anyway. And then during braising season, you would remove all those small muscles that you could still market, and even in your grilling season. But during braising season, do a chuck roll, and off of a standard beef you could get on about 8 5-pound chuck rolls, cleaned up good, and then people could put those in their crock pot, and people could, really have a rich meal at that point. With your rounds, during the summertime, I'd recommend off your top round, it's your most tender of round, making either stir fry out of it, and then I would grind the rest. The bottom and eye round, unless you're making like Versala, isn't really good. Anything you need to use in the summertime, you can make stew meat during the wintertime out of your top round, but your bottom rounds, even if it braises so long and it's so lean, it's going to be a dry stew, and it's going to be chewy afterwards. With your bottom round, you can cut it and get up a point, middle, and flat roast out of it. But besides in books, I haven't seen those. Those were popular in the Depression.
Just a quick on it, as my customer base on the top rounds and stuff, we're also, as the pallets change, right? We're also getting a lot of inquiries on jerky.
Yeah, absolutely.
They want to do their own at home, and so that's where that top round comes. That's a good. You'll get the top dollar for that lesser cut.
Yeah, and thanks. I completely forgot about jerky as an added value, that you could take your gooseneck or your bottom round with your eye round still attached. It's still really tough, but like when I used to slaughter whole dairy cows, all of them would go into grind except for the goosenecks, and the top round would go to a jerky place. And if someone who marinates or tumbles them could make even the eye round and the bottom round tender. And then you could, a lot of places make stir fry out of the rounds. I would recommend slicing your bottom round and eye round thinner than you would your top round, because you have big, thick muscle fibers in there. You could also make cube steak out of it by running it through a cuber, which a lot of people, that's what chicken fried steak essentially is a cube steak battered and fried. And then you can make, which hasn't been around since the Great Depression, a Swiss steak, which is a bottom round cut about that thick into a steak cooked in gravy. And I worked with this old cutter who said he could always tell when his wife was mad at him because she would cook that for dinner. Yeah, because they would just be really, really chewy. And then, tenderloin, seasonally, obviously you could have your the whole tenderloin roast, which people may want around Christmas time, or you could package it. And I like tenderloins about the size of my fist, a good sized tenderloin like that, wrapped in bacon, personally. If I want to eat the tenderloin, they're very lean and overrated. And then your ribeye, you're going to. I would recommend, if you're, depending on how many animals you're growing, during the wintertime, it would be great to take a ribeye and cut it into at least 2 standing rib roasts, partially French with the cap hole, the ribs cut off and then tied back on. And as you're cutting a wrap, if you need a standing rib roast, ask them if they peel those ribs off and tie them back on. Because that's really important during the cooking process, that if you're serving a standing rib roast that you cooked all day, then all of a sudden you have to partially bone out part of it to cut, when you could just remove the strings, set aside the back ribs, and then slice it evenly is a lot more user-friendly for the consumer, especially when everyone's looking at them during that carving time, and then they fumble with the and then beef flank, you could just use it year-round. There's a muscle on the inside right here called we call it the sirloin flap. People call it the bavette. Bavette just means steak in French. And you can make your steak tips out of that, or turn it into stir fry. I'd recommend butterflying it and skewering it and make it into like a teriyaki stir fry. It's really good. It's just to find a cut and wrap that will pull that is a little bit more difficult. When I worked on the East Coast, it did nothing with it. That would be the tail on the New York. It would be cut in half and kind of useless. But it's making a resurgence, especially here on the West Coast. And then there is also skirt steaks. You should be able to sell year-round. If you want more skirt steaks, there's an inner and outer skirt. And then that sirloin flap, if you cut at a bias, would be also good for carnitas. And then, you could also get carnitas at your bottom round if you find someone who can butterfly and cut thin enough. Anything else? Any questions?
What about seasonality on pork?
Seasonality on pork? It's going to be kind of the same on beef. You're going to, of course, have your pork chops, and you're going to have your standing pork roast. Your pork butts, or your whole skin-on big pork butts, are going to be a smoking cut. So those are actually going to be in the wintertime. When you take your cocoa roll out of your pork butt, that's going to be more of a braising cut. And then that would be more in the summertime. That's going to be what the beef, or the equivalent of a beef chuck roll. And then you're going to, your belly and bacon, you should be able to sell year round. But again, if you find a buyer who wants a whole porchetta or wants that English bacon or rasher bacon, that may change as well. And then pork sirloin is, I again would recommend grinding it in the summertime and then turning it into sausage, because sausage, people always want to have like 10 different types of sausages. If you have one sausage that's you're selling out of, just have one sausage you sell out of. Just and ground pork is, if you market ground pork, you could say you can make your own sauce, your own pork bolognese, things like that. So I do that with the sirloin. Except for wintertime, I would butterfly it and season it and make like a little tiny porchetta that would be about that big. And then out of the ham, you could get pork cutlets out of it, and that would be good in the summertime. But also, when I'm buying pork, I always get buyers trying to push hams on me, which tells me that they're always having a hard time selling hams. That and sirloins and shanks. So, because everyone wants the money cuts, the shoulder, the ribs, and the bacon, and the tenderloin. But with hams, you could turn it into cutlets. If you turn it into sausage, you need to supplement fat. Hams are about 90-10 lean to fat ratio, and a good sausage is 70-30. So you want to save your back fat off your sausage to add it in that. And you also want to mix it real well, but not over well. You don't want to smear or split in, because I could tell when there's a bad sausage. I could tell when there's a lean ham sausage. It just has this grainy mouthfeel. And it also purges a lot when it's not mixed properly. During the mixing stage, you create this thing called myosin. And myosin essentially is protein extracted from the meat through salinity that binds it together. That's why best example, you add your spices to hamburger, and then work it together, and then you could pick it up in a form from and you could hold half of it right there. That's myosin, essentially. And if you have really lean, purgy ham, you don't get that, and it falls apart and it crumbles, and it'll also be dry because the fat content is so small that you're going to end up with a dry sausage. And other things out of the ham, of course, you can make just a traditional bone-in or 3-piece boneless ham. Right now, I'm making about 1,000 pounds of those a week, preparing for Thanksgiving and Easter. I mean, not Easter, Christmas. And then you could take your hams as well, and you could bone them out, end up with essentially your bottom round with your eye round still attached to it, your top round, and your knuckle. And then you could cure those and net those individually, and end up with single muscle hams and then sweetheart ham. Those are perfect for smaller families versus like having this whole ham that's this big. You could end up with like just a ham like that's big. You know, that's why we call them sweethearts, because it's meant for 2 people. And nothing really else on the pork. The pork shanks.
You can seasonally cut the picnic, don't you, right? You can either do a steak.
Yeah, so the picnic, 90% of what I do with the picnic is trim it. But if you may notice when you go to cash and carry that their picnic is way cheaper than pork shoulders because they have the excess of it. Picnic's genuinely leaner, but you could braise it just like you would a pork shoulder. You could pull it. You just want to add a little bit of fat to it and not dry it out. There's a muscle, this muscle right here. It's called the clod in beef. And on a picnic, it is, we call it the cushion. And you could take that and make a little sweetheart ham out of that, or you could dry cure it and make it into like essentially like a pork copa, which is just using a different muscle. Because it is so lean that you'll avoid rancidity out of it. You could also take a whole picnic roast, which I've done in competition, and then butterfly it with the bone sticking out, and then roll it back in, and then score it, and then wrap it in caul fat and seasons and all that stuff as well. And then a lot of people, when they break pigs, they break them between the 3rd and 4th rib. If you break them between the 5th and 6th rib, you could get off the picnic, you get this little section of rib called the copa ribs, and they are the fattiest but more meat ratio than other spare ribs. They're actually the most full of flavor and the hardest to sell. So if I'm going to cook spare ribs, I'm going to grab those ribs. And they're usually separate. Most places will just bone tight to the bone and then put that excess meat into trim. Yeah. And